The other argument is, and oh, well, you've certainly heard this because I've heard it since I've come to Pakistan. I've heard it as long as I can remember in the Arab world as well as in the United States. That argument is that, well, it's the Israeli Zionist lobby, oftentimes called incorrectly the Jewish lobby in the United States. It happens that that lobby consists of Jews, but they don't represent all the Jews in the United States. But the point is that they have, amazingly, been able to be the tail of the dog because of their small population that is actually controlling the whole animal or the whole dog for a whole variety of reasons. I must say that I am I think there's more to be said about this second argument than there is about the first argument. And I'll try to say a little bit more of that tomorrow. Both of those things probably hold to some extent. It's an amazing fact. If I take the second argument, there are at most 6 million Jews in the United States. 6 million. The population is what? 270? Over 270 million. Of the 6 million Jews, I can tell you that only a minority are really within this fold. The majority of Jews in the United States, they may give some money every year because they're asked by Jewish organizations and others and rabbis who put some pressure upon them. But the majority of American Jews, they don't care very much about Israel. They don't care and they don't know very much about Palestinians. They don't even care very much about the Middle East. That's probably a majority. Of the rest of them, well, there are different categories of how much support is there. If I take all of the American Jewish organizations, 27 of them, national organizations, 26 of them are avowedly, they say they are Zionist organizations. The one that's not is a tiny organization. But if I take all the organizations, they have at most, in terms of membership, they have at most 1.5 million members. 1.5 million out of 6 million. And all members are not active anyway. Well, you get the point that those people who say in the United States that they're the leaders of Zionist organizations and they speak for American Jews, I can tell you and I can document this. They don't speak for all American Jews. They don't even speak for a majority of American Jews. They just speak the loudest. And they seem to they show credentials that are actually, I would say, mostly invalid credentials. So it then is amazing that those who are in this Israeli lobby have been able to exert the influence that they have exerted. Because it's quite right, if one looks at the interests of the United States, the interests of the United States in terms of the Middle East, however one looks, from whatever perspective one has of interests of the United States, those interests do not on balance, they're not on balance interests that are there with the state of Israel. So it is rather amazing, but it's nevertheless a fact. And if you allow me to say this again, I'll try to speak a bit more of it tomorrow. Finally, though, let me say, we have another element here, and that's an element called the Christian Zionists. I'll say something about them tomorrow too. There are a good many people, including a good many Israeli Jews, including most of the top people in the Sharon government, who believe now that the Christian Zionists in the United States are far more important to them than the Israeli lobby or the Jews who are Zionists in the United States. Just let me conclude this little discourse here in answer to your question, Roger, that as of this day, with the administration that exists in Washington, with the Bush administration, and with the Congress as it's presently constituted, no one can be hopeful that this change is imminent. Certainly, it's true with the Bush administration, as I'll point out tomorrow, and certainly it's true in Congress. Less than a year ago, 95 out of 100 senators, we have 100 senators, 95 out of 100 senators signed a petition that was printed in newspapers throughout the United States in which they fully and totally backed the state of Israel and its policies, and in which there was even some criticism of the Bush administration. Well, that does not indicate to me, nor should it indicate to anyone else, that Congress, in the House of Representatives, it may not be quite that percentage, but the percentage is almost there. That doesn't indicate that the government of the United States is anywhere close to changing its policy in regard to Israel, which I repeat again, is about as close to blind support as we can come.
Educational media. Certainly within the Islamic tradition, we have our share of misrepresentation of other faiths, and that's something which continues to be an area of interest for me. In terms of the Jewish educational system, especially the religious schools, I was wondering if you have any information on misrepresentation of other faiths, especially Islam, and then how that may filter its way into the popular media as well. There is also a certain level of misperception, especially in Pakistan, which you may have come across, that the media is completely controlled by certain constituencies, and certainly the Jewish lobby is incriminated often, so to speak, in quotes, even though Rupert Murdoch is certainly not, in that way practicing Jew or not Jewish by lineage in any way. So I don't know how that can be addressed, those kinds of issues as well.
Two parts to your question. I suppose we could have, there are two ways to look at it. One, religious schools. That's right. We're not in Israel. The Jewish schools are religious schools. Just as there's a variance in Judaism and a variance among Jews as to how they view Israel, how they view Zionism, how they view all of this, there's a variance in those schools. Those are schools that are, for the most part, almost all, run by synagogues and run by rabbis. And I would say that in the extreme schools, in the ones that are extreme, listen, those schools that are schools of the fundamentalist faction that exists in the United States, although it's a tiny minority of the Jews, in those schools there are many negative things about not only Islam, but any religion other than Judaism. That includes Islam. I would suppose that, especially after 9/11, well, maybe even before, probably even before 9/11, given Arab-Israeli conflict and all of that, maybe even a little more negative about Islam. But that's only a small number of the synagogue or religious schools. Now, otherwise in those schools, there is, I would say to you, there is not negativism that is taught about Islam. There is not negativism that is taught about Christianity. There is a lot of negativism that is, it's either done subtly or sometimes it's done not so subtly. We have a good many studies of that. I myself know a good many of those schools firsthand. Now, it's not sometimes subtle and many times not subtle in regard to Arabs. I mean, there's an Arab-Israeli conflict, and so there's lots of negativism about Arabs. In many of those schools, by the way, there is an attempt, and a fairly successful attempt, to divide criticism of Arabs from criticism of Islam. That changed to some extent, as it did more broadly in American society. Changed to some extent. I don't know to what extent, but it certainly changed to some extent after 9/11. Largely, I think, because of what's been in the general atmosphere in the United States. It's changed to some extent, but only to some extent. Now, within Israel, it's a different story. Within Israel, the religious schools, the fundamentalist religious schools, and even some of the religious schools that are not of the fundamentalist ilk, in those schools which are, they're independently run. One thing the religious parties have achieved within Israel from the beginning, they've achieved the independence to run their own schools. The rest of the schools are under some public control that the religious schools are really not under. In those religious schools, there continues to be a good deal of negativism about Arabs. It varies too. A good deal of negativism also about Islam. In the public schools, which are encompass far more of the Israeli public, since about 75% of the Israeli public anyway is not religious at all, and 40% are anti-religious. In those schools, there has been an attempt most of the time. Are there exceptions? Of course. There are exceptions probably in any kind of grouping. Islam is not really negatively attacked. There are stereotypes and images of Arabs that are often subtle somewhat, but are negative nevertheless. There have been studies in which the argument has been those stereotypes are not so great today in these public schools as they were a decade ago or 2 decades ago. There are other studies that indicate that there has not been a change. So there are some of those images as well, but it's mixed. But we have to keep in mind that there is a difference here between, oftentimes, most of the time, between what is said about Islam and even what is said about Muslims. Again, after 9/11, some change. But there's a difference between that and what is said about and what is said about what the stereotypes are of Arabs per se. Now, in terms of exaggerations that exist in Pakistan, well, I mean, I spent 3 days in Lahore, and I mean, it's not the first time that I've heard of this, but I mean, I was face to face with these the most negative kinds of images, not just of Israel, but of Jews per se. I mean, it can't be more negative than to say all you Jews are going to be destroyed in the end time. I mean, well, I guess some people would say that there are things more negative than that, but it's hard for me to comprehend that. Anyway, I know that exists. I know there are other exaggerations, not only in Pakistan, but throughout the Arab world. Lots of exaggerations and lots of major errors, such as being anti-Semitic, really, clearly, talking about Jews and how evil they are, and pinpointing how bad and negative policies of the State of Israel are and how oppressive they are, and not distinguishing between Zionism and Judaism and Zionism and Jews. There are people in the Muslim world who do distinguish that, who criticize that there's not that distinction, but there is a lot of that, and there's a lot of exaggeration of that, and it's probably grown. Let me cite this, not for Pakistan, for Egypt. I was in Egypt about 1 month after 9/11, and I lectured at Cairo University, and I was really surprised by this. I had an audience of about 300, and most of them were academics. And many of them were academics who knew a good deal about the United States. And some of them were academics who also knew a good deal about Jews. As opposed to others, academics and others, who don't know very much about Jews, who don't know very much about Judaism, and who then talk as though they know a tremendous amount and they need to learn more. But anyway, I had an audience of 300 or so, and I was amazed that in that audience, with very few exceptions, and the few people who came up to me and indicated that they were people with exceptional ideas, they didn't even want to air that during the discussion, because they were so much in a minority. Now, I grant you there's only a month after 9/11, but I heard this from this audience. I didn't hear it out in the street, where it wouldn't have surprised me so much. An argument that I know you've heard here, and probably it's still aired, that if I take 9/11, they said, well, that was really engineered by the Israeli Secret Service perhaps in conjunction with the CIA, and they also told me, they said all the Jews who worked in the World Trade Center were notified 1, 2, or 3 days before 9/11 not to come to work that day, and they didn't go to work because this was going to happen. Well, the best answer I had for them was, which was a true and correct answer to which there was no response, was that I had a very good friend who was a Jew, who worked in the World Trade Center, who went to work that day. He didn't get this message, and he was killed. I mean, so I'm saying, yes, of course this exists. This whole business exists. And as I tried to say in Lahore, I'll say it here again since you've asked me, it seems to me that if I go for a minute to the Arab world, it seems to me, and I'll suggest this humbly, I mean, I can only, as an outsider, suggest, and I would say most humbly, I would suggest that here in Pakistan, as well as in other places, including throughout much of the Arab Middle East as well, and I'm almost sure in other places of South Asia as well, where there are goodly numbers of Muslims, there needs to be much more knowledge again about Jews, about Judaism, about Israel, and about Zionism, because the exaggerations not only exist, but they obviously have expanded since 9/11.
I think yes, briefly, we have only a couple of minutes.
A question that is derived from the wrong answer that you gave just now. Why is it that the image of the Jews, right from the time of Jesus Christ, majority? And if you include the characters like Shylock that were created by Shakespeare, what triggered them, and why have it, and if we include the definition of Jude Ford in the International Jewish Book, he says that Jews were the only people who had the courage to stand in against their own prophet when he came with dictates.
Well, I'll try not to be so long in my answer, but you know, it's difficult for me, not just because I'm a professor, but because these are questions that entail lengthy answers, and I don't want to go back and not be able to sleep tonight because I feel guilty that I didn't say a lot of things that I should have said. But all right, now, first of all, is an exaggeration. In other words, if I take historically, the image of Jews has not always been so very bad. Not been so bad in lots of places. Are there negative images? There are. But you know, we can take literature, can't we, from around the world, and we can take what we know about the history of cultures in ways other than literature from around the world, and we can find negative images of Christians and plenty of negative images of Muslims, and negative images of Sikhs, and negative images of almost any other grouping. We can find that, and we can probably find that consistently if we want. I mean, we can find it consistently. The fact that we find it doesn't mean that we're allowed to, entailed to, or we can in any valid way necessarily generalize that that negative, bad image has always been there. As a matter of fact, it is not. Now, among Jews, I can tell you that when people start to generalize about Jews, many Jews will immediately say it's anti-Semitic because you're generalizing about Jews. Of course, some of those Jews who say that, they are quick to do the same thing when they're talking about Arabs or when they're talking about Christians sometimes or about other groupings. But I'm just, I suppose, cautioning you not to think that that image is always consistently so bad. And anyway, the reality is more important than the image. And we also know historically, or we should know historically, that for much of history, Jews in most places, including of course the Arab world, the Arab Middle East, Jews got along very well indeed. They didn't always get along very, very well. There was persecution well before Zionism of some, persecution of lots of groupings. But Jews got along very well indeed, and if I take Israel, Palestine, Palestinians and Jews, Palestinians before they were called Palestinians, and Jews in many places, much of the time got along. There was also conflict. So I'm just saying we shouldn't generalize about that. And finally, by prophet, you mean the prophet you're talking about is Jesus. Is that correct? About who? They reacted. Well, look, we have the biblical story. If one believes, yes, it's true. The biblical story. Here comes Moses with those two slabs and the 10 Commandments, and everyone is dancing around the golden calf, and I'm being brief with the story, of course, and so he gets all upset, right, and he breaks them and so on. Well, I suppose that for the ones who believe in what we call in Hebrew, Torah min hashamayim, as very traditional Jews do, that every word of the 5 books of Moses is the word of God, so that actually happened as it did, they might have a little more difficult time answering this, except they would say, well, Jews at times, even all of them with the exception of one, they sin. Well, other people have sinned too. Christians have sinned, Muslims have sinned. Today, we have a good many Christian leaders who point out how many Christians are sinning. I don't have to tell many of you people. We have some Islamic leaders who certainly talk about how Muslims are sinning. Again, I heard one talk about that for 3 days in a row. So that's not unique with Jews. There's a point. But then we have a goodly number of Jews, some of whom are religious, many of whom are religious also, who don't believe necessarily that every word is the word of God, that story happened just as it's written in the Bible. So they believe that, there are the Bible, the messages in the Bible that are important are spiritual messages, moral messages, ethical messages, and here we have an example. Here we have a story, if you will, that shows us something, that is to teach us something about why obedience to God is important. Again, we can't quite say, here we have an example that we can generalize, from which we can generalize that indicates something negative about Jews, and that story, if one doesn't believe Torah min hashamayim, every word is the word of God necessarily in the Bible, that story may be apocryphal. I mean, it may not quite have happened that way, that here comes Moses and all this happened.
The last question, brief one, followed by brief answer.
Followed by a brief answer. Thank you.
State is using religion for political gain. They twist religion, same is being done by Israel and others. I would like to comment here and ask a question. What the large majority of right-thinking people are doing to curb the thinking of the few fanatics? I will not call them fundamentalists. If it is fundamentalism to follow your religion properly, I am a fundamentalist also. But it is the fanatics who have taken hostage the whole world. What is the right thinking people is doing about it?
I'll answer that briefly.
Let us.
They're looking at me as though that's not possible, you see, for me to be brief. In the beginning of the book that Israel Shachak and I wrote, titled Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, we have a preface or an introduction that I wrote in which I say that we are two Jews, one Israeli and one American, who love the history of our people and we love our religion. But we think that we have an obligation, as do other people have an obligation, to criticize the negative elements in their past. So I would say that what should be done, perhaps first of all, is that people should not be reticent to do this. They should go out of their way to be critical of the negative things in the past of the history of their people and in the past of the history of their religion. I don't know any religion. I don't know so much about a number of religions, but certainly I can say this from what I know about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, that in those three religions, in the history of those religions, negative things have happened by people who have... Right. Now, so Muslims should be critical of their past. Christians should be critical of their past. Jews should be critical of their past. After all, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, as we all know, they are not reticent from being critical of the other people's religious histories and past. They should be critical of their own. I would say that's a very good beginning point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norman. We have had a very live and educative discussion on the Jewish perspective on global peace and justice. Now we have two presentations on Christian perspective, one by Dr. Ian Marshall and the other by Dr. Ralph Elber. I would suggest to the two learned speakers to divide their time equally between the two. We had originally planned to have 20 minutes of presentation. Now perhaps they would have to complete their presentations in 10 minutes each, so that we may have a half an hour discussion later.
Just don't blame that on me.
Okay. I think 15 each. 15 each. I would give the floor to Dr. Ayman.
डॉक्टर साहब चाय के लिए भी कह दीजिए अवेलेबल है
Just intervene. Anybody who would like to have a cup of tea, please feel free to pick up. Well, pick up and join. That's the best way.
Thank you very much. Let me start using one of my precious 15 minutes by thanking the Institute for Studies. Thanking our hosts. We're having a delightful time, particularly Natalie Pullman Ludwig. I thoroughly enjoyed being in the hall. Looking forward to getting to know Islamabad. And I'm enjoying the food when it's not too spicy, but it's lovely. It's been a complete delight. Global peace and justice, the Christian perspective. The way we've divided our is I'm going to focus on the historical positions that Christians have taken on this topic, and my colleague and friend Dr. Ralph Ulberg will look at the American attitudes to global peace and justice amongst Christians there. Broadly, in the Christian tradition, you find traditions which have evolved and developed. The first is grounded in the teachings of Jesus Christ. And here, peace and justice are inseparable. And the witness to pacifism is an important part of the witness to justice. Now, according to much contemporary New Testament scholarship, there is no doubt that Jesus taught pacifism. He is, of course, addressing a people who are under military occupation, and he quite explicitly, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, explains that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is what the law says, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, what Jesus is doing here is he's not disagreeing with the law that he's inherited from Judaism. He believes in the principle of entitlement, i.e. you take no more from the wrongdoer than has been done to you. So you don't take 2 eyes if you've only had 1 eye injured. But however, he says instead of taking your entitlement, the right thing to do is to absorb the violence. Why? Because if you retaliate, then you'll provoke counter-violence. And then you'll have the cycle of violence, revenge, violence, and counter-revenge. In other words, for Jesus of Nazareth, you should absorb the violence and you don't pass it on. And you don't take your legal entitlement. This runs parallel with his teaching on forgiveness. He was asked by the disciple Peter, how many times am I required to forgive somebody who's done a wrong to me? Is 7 sufficient? And Jesus replied, no, 70 times 7. In other words, you forgive as many times as necessary. You absorb violence, you absorb the wrong, and when the other person is penitent, you then accept their penitence. You don't continue to live in the past. It's very important in Christian theology that Jesus died on a cross. Because Jesus did not only teach pacifism, but he lived it. And he lived it to the point of death, willing to take the injustice that he had to cope with. And of course, in the Christian drama, it's very important that at that point, Jesus is resurrected by God as the vindication of the teaching of Jesus and as witness to who Jesus was.